Oh, getting real, getting real. Everybody wants to talk sooner or later about, it's time to get real. Talk about where I'm really at, what's really going on in my life. And it seems like church is one of those places where we're always discussing how real can we get and how authentic is everything. And recently I was reading in Relevant Magazine, a great little kind of online magazine. They make the paper copies too. But there's an article by a pastor, a 20-something pastor out of L.A., and he was writing an article called being Authentic is More Than Just Being Honest. And so his opening to this article, at one point he said, I think the cry for authenticity stems out of the reality that we're a generation let down by previous ones. Past ideals don't work for us. We're fed up with wearing masks and hiding the truth about ourselves in an effort to blend in because it starves our hearts and leaves us empty. We crave a place and a people where we can be our true selves with and be true with ourselves and be truly loved. We're crawling out from the bushes and searching for more. We're calling others out to do the same too and are correcting new standards for relationships. However, the quest for meaning isn't without its challenges. Authenticity itself is hard to define, and because of that, it's even harder to find in churches. Authenticity in the church is the quality of exposure of brokenness and adornment in God's grace. An authentic person is one who is both privately and publicly putting off the old self and by God's grace putting on the renewed self. This kind of authenticity expresses itself different in people based on their unique journeys, but it is unmistakably glorifying to God. I was intrigued by this pastor's article about, being honest and trying to create an honest and authentic church. He's a 20-something, and he began by saying, we're tired of the generation before us who basically didn't get it right. We want something different. We want to be more genuine. And originally, when I read that, I sort of laughed because, back in the 1990s, the Gen X generation, who was ahead of the millennials, was saying the same thing. We're tired of the baby boomer moms and dads and the way they've done church, and we want to do it differently, and we want to be an authentic church, and we're going to create authenticity in our churches. And what was kind of weird is their baby boomer mom and dads were saying the same thing when they started to do churches in the 70s and 80s. They were saying, we're tired of our builder parents. They didn't get it right. We want to build an authentic church, and so they did. And of course, their builder generation parents were saying, you know what? Great-grandma was kind of wild, what with her coming through the speakeasy time and then the Depression. They didn't get it right, and they didn't talk to us. We want to build an authentic church, which they tried to do in the 50s and 60s, and so the cycle goes, right? Every generation saying, the previous one couldn't get real, our generation will get real. And the next generation always says, yeah, we didn't get that one right. I set out in the late 1990s to plant a church, and one of the hallmarks of our church at that time was going to be authenticity. We kind of come out of a background of church that was high program, high structure, high developed in terms of the presentation that went on. It was the whole seeker movement thing where you put on this really excellent show and you make the show work really well, and then people will be drawn to that incredible Sunday morning service that is literally an event that you put on for everyone around a theme, and then out of that crowd that comes, you try to build community. And some of us are sort of tired of the inauthenticness of it and the frustrations of that. We want to build an authentic church where people got real with each other. And I discovered right away that nobody really wants an authentic church. You know what they want? They want a church where everybody else has to be authentic. Very true, right? Because I'll tell you something, when you get into an authentic church, people get to know each other, they tell each other stories, they're able to deal with hard issues, that kind of thing, and sooner or later, your turn comes. And if people get really honest with each other, sooner or later, they're going to get honest with you. And then you're going to go, oh, I don't want this. So I found it was really funny. Everybody wanted a church where everyone else had to be authentic, but they got to play all their cards close to the vest, put up a wall, and not be real themselves. And that's kind of how the system works. When we set out to leave downtown and move up here, you're taking a 128-year-old church and moving it into the new neighborhood to do a new thing, a lot of our dialogue was, well, what kind of church do we want to be? What do we want it to look like? What do we want it to feel like? What of our history do we want to keep? What do we want to let go of? What do we want to do that's new and different? And when we set out, we said, well, there's a few core values that we're going to have. When we move to the new neighborhood, we want to develop these new core values. And I think there's a vision and values brochure on most of your tables like this, kind of what we're about. And we said, well, here we're going to be the top 5 priorities that we were going to set out to try to build inside the culture of the Gathering House Church when we moved up to the new neighborhood. And today is the 1-year anniversary of being in this neighborhood and having church services here. So it's a good time to review them. And we'll spend the month of April kind of going through each one of these. we decided that our vision and values would be to love the Lord our God with all our heart, love the Lord our God with all our soul, love the Lord our God with all our mind, love the Lord our God with all our strength, and to share his love with others. And this comes from a passage that Jesus had, where he was actually asked, what is the most important Bible verse in all of the Old Testament? If you could take the entire Old Testament and boil it down to only one theme, one idea, one statement, what's the main theme of the entire Old Testament? And he was challenged to answer this question, and he gave that answer. And let's take a look at that. It's found in Mark chapter 12. In Mark chapter 12, and I think, let's see what page is that going to be in these. If we're using one of the blue and white Bibles that we provide, it's going to be on page 693. And a little backstory here before we read this, starting in verse 28. Little backstory is that Jesus is now at the very tail end of his life. He's literally a couple days before being crucified. He's at the high point of the miraculous side of his whole ministry. He's done miracles. People have followed him. He's had the whole parade coming into Jerusalem with the palm branches being laid down. They're hailing him as hero, as king. They think he's going to set up a new government and overthrow the Romans. The Romans that are watching out for him because they're not sure what's going to happen here. The religious leaders can't stand him, because he's not one of them, and he's saying things that are kind of defying their power structure. So this huge confrontation is blowing down into this moment. And standing in the temple courts for the few days prior to being crucified, he has these encounters with people. He will have these encounters with the religious leaders. He'll be challenged in many ways, and he'll keep giving answers to who he is. At one point, this one scholar is watching the whole thing go down and steps up and asks Jesus this question. It says, one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating, meaning Jesus and the religious leaders. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he asked him, of all the commandments, which is the most important? And in some ways, it's a little bit of a trick question. To the Jewish people, it's like, well, there's no such thing as the most important. All the commands of God were important. Not one law was higher than another. To their thinking, the idea was that it's all one big thing. They had taken the entire Old Testament and over the centuries had broken it down and sort of sifted out what are the actual commands that are listed in there. And they had come up with 613 different commands from the Old Testament that they as a Jewish people were required to do. And then they took each of those commands, and over time, rabbis had written on what each commandment meant. So when the command was honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, they had reams and reams of material that had been written over the centuries saying, what does honoring the Sabbath mean? How do we keep the Sabbath holy? What kind of work do we do? And so on and on. They had lots of rules and regulations underneath each of the 613 commands. And the idea was it's all the Word of God, so none of it's more important than another. So in some ways, this scholar is asking Jesus a trick question. But I think what he's really trying to get to is the heart of the matter. What if you took this entire Old Testament and you broke the whole thing down and you said, of this portion of the Bible, what's it all about? What's it all about? Can you tell me what it's all about in one sentence? What's the meaning? What's the theme? What's the idea? What's it getting at? Why was it written? That's kind of what he's saying to Jesus. What's the most important thing? And Jesus gives this answer. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Well said, teacher, the man replied. You are right in saying that God is one and there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. When Jesus saw that, he had answered wisely, he said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions. It's interesting because Jesus gives this answer. What's it all about? What's the main theme? Here it is. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's the greatest commandment of them all. And actually in the parallel account that's told in Matthew, he adds the words, all the law and the prophets hang on this verse. Meaning all the rest that was written was all written about fulfilling loving the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And it's kind of interesting because as I initially was reading that, I thought, well, in America, that's not what we hear as number one. When we hear people say, well, what's the number one rule? What's the golden rule? Treat other people the way you want to be treated. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's number one. How I treat that's number one. We skip over the fact that Jesus said, no, that's number two. That's the second most important. The single first most important is loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second one is loving your neighbor as yourself. I'll oftentimes hear people say, well, all religions are the same because they all teach the golden rule, and so that's what it's all about. And I'm like, well, if you think that, then you haven't really studied any religions. Because the number one rule in Christianity and Judaism is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It's kind of interesting because when Jesus quoted that, he actually doesn't quote the passage correctly. When you go back to see where he was quoting, he adds a word, which makes it kind of interesting. The original passage he's quoting is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Way back near the beginning of your Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So in Deuteronomy chapter 6, we get the original text that's going on. In this case, it's Moses. And Moses is giving the law to the second generation of Hebrews who've come out of slavery. When the original group got released from slavery in Egypt and they had the 10 plagues and all that and the firstborn of the dead and they came through the Red Sea, wandered in the desert, they got to the edge of the promised land and they were about to go into the promised land. God says, go in and take it. And they chickened out and said, no, we can't do it. So God had said, okay, because you don't trust me, I've just led you out of Egypt with power. If you could take on Egypt, you sure could have taken on the Canaanites. But since you don't trust me, here's what's going to happen. Everybody 20 years older than a year of 20, is going to die in the desert. And a new generation will be born, and they will come of age. And when that new generation is born, I'll give them the promised land. So they were kicked out from Kadesh Barnea. They wandered for 40 years in the desert till everybody 20 years and older was dead except 3 guys. Caleb, Joshua, Moses. The only 3 left from that original generation who'd come out who were 20 years or older. And then they come back to the edge, back to the same place again. They're about to take the promised land. Moses knows he can't go. He knows from something he did that he's not going to be allowed into the promised land. So he's standing on one side of the Jordan River, and he gathers this mighty nation of Israelites in front of him. Now it's their turn. It's been 40 years, and he gives them the law. All the things that God had given at Mount Sinai 40 years earlier, he tells them again the law. Here's what's important. Here's what God wants you to know. You're about to go into the promised land, and I ain't going with you. So here's what you need to know. And he gives them the law a second time. Deutero is the Greek, so it's a Deuteronomy, means second law. And in Deuteronomy chapter 6, it says, these are the commands, decrees, and the laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, O Israel, be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in the land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. That's the original. All your heart, your soul, and your strength. But when we get to Mark and they ask Jesus the very same question, it's interesting because he doesn't quote it exactly that way. When they ask Jesus, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Why does Jesus add the extra word, the mind? Well, in the time that the Jews had first had this, Moses is about 1450 BC. When he's writing, their understanding was where your emotions go, that's who you really are. So your heart and your passion, all of that goes with that. All of that is part of the whole equation of how you think, how you act. As you act, so you think. But what had happened over the centuries is the Greek culture had arisen. About 500 years before Jesus, you get Plato and Aristotle, and you get the great Greek philosophers. And the Greeks had arisen, and they had separated emotion and logic. And they had started to talk about the mind being the logic, the will, the decision, as something that has nothing to do with emotions. And they even had schools of thought that says as long as you think right, so it doesn't really matter how you feel. Your feelings are irrelevant. And so they had this sort of split in the way people understood the mind and the heart to be. And we Americans have inherited that. We've inherited that Greek way of thinking, that the emotions are one thing and the will is another, logic's another. That's part of what's come down to us from Western civilization through the Greek culture. So when they went, and around just a little bit before Jesus' time, they went to translate the Old Testament into Greek. And the reason they're translating it into Greek is Alexander the Great had conquered the world and everybody now spoke Greek. He did it about 300 years before Jesus. Everybody had to speak Greek, so that became the common tongue. So now you're going to translate the old Hebrew into the common tongue. When they reach that passage, the Greek translators are doing it. They reach that passage, they're like, well, if we say love him with all your heart and with all your soul and all your strength, all of these common people who've been raised on Greek philosophy won't understand we do mean the logic too. So they added the word mind in the Greek Septuagint. so that the common people would understand we're not talking about just emotional heebie-jeebies, we're talking about logic as well. So when Jesus goes to quote the passage, for the common people he's talking to, he's quoting the Greek version of the Old Testament of Deuteronomy chapter 6. And he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. It's all woven together. And these would become, as we've decided to move up here, said these are the best core values we could have. If you're going to set core values in a church, shouldn't they be based on the things that Jesus said were the single most important things? Loving the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so today I want to talk about heart. Because the question is, how do you love God with all your heart? What does that look like? When I first came to faith, it was in a Holy Roller Pentecostal church. And in a Holy Roller Pentecostal church, loving God with your heart meant when we did worship, you better get into the worship frenzy. Right? You better have the whole heebie, you better get the feelings, and you better get your groove on, and there better be a lot of dancing, and people would fall on the floor, and other folks would put hankies on them, and folks would jump pews. It was quite wild, and the whole church would pray in tongues at once. And you had this emotional high getting into the worship frenzy, and lots of tears would flow and that kind of thing. And, some of it was genuine, some of it was not. But even when it was genuine, the problem in that school of thought was, if you can't sustain that emotional frenzy, something's wrong with your relationship with God. Right? And, of course, that's not true. God's not an emotional frenzy kind of, relationship with us. He does have these incredible moments when emotions run high, but that's not what sustains the relationship. What sustains it is the intensity of love and adoration and obedience. But for a season, I thought that was, and I drifted from there to Presbyterian Baptist kind of schools of thought where they're like, we subdue all emotions, and we are all about the mind, and so we are logic and doctrine. And we're going to talk to you about dispensationalism, and we're going to discuss amillennialism and premillennial eschatology, and we're going to discuss all the doctrines of the hypostatic union, and you will know and understand theology and doctrine. And most of you have no idea what I just said. Right? And they were all about the mind. And sometimes I've been in some churches that lean more towards social action and social justice. We're going to love God through the social action, serving the poor and that kind of thing. And what God has always asked us to do is hold all this stuff in balance. Hold it all in balance. And don't overemphasize any one piece. And as I got to looking in this, I thought, but realistically, God, when we do this, there kind of needs to be a starting point. What makes us love you with all of our heart? What makes us love you with all of our soul? What's the starting point? And in other words, if I had to, because I'm a limited human, if I can only get one right, what's the one I should get right? And as I've looked at this, I've thought the answer is get the first one right. Loving the Lord your God with all your heart. Because if you get that one right, the others will follow on it. The other stuff follows on it. And I have had seasons where I love God with all my mind, but the other stuff doesn't follow on the logic and the will and the doctrine. It follows on the connectivity to God through the heart of who we are. So I decided it's more than just a nice affection for God. Loving God with all your heart doesn't mean, I have warm, fuzzy feelings for God. Let me tell you something. If you've been a Christian for very long at all, if you've been there a long time, you already know this. If you're new to it, I'm going to tell you, there will be major seasons of your life when you will not have warm, fuzzy feelings about God, when you will be angry at Him, when He will feel silent to you, when He will feel unfair to you, when He won't answer your prayers the way you command Him to when you pray. And you will have moments in your life when you're going to look at God and you're like, I don't even know if I know you. And you just stay in it because God's like, I'm going to work through this. You will not always have the warm, fuzzy feelings with God. He's going to break you through to new ground. I decided to kind of look at this issue of heart, and I started to realize there's over 600 references to the word heart in the Old Testament alone. And I printed a bunch of them, not all 600, of course, but a bunch of them on this little pink flyer on your tables. I just printed some out, and you're free to take some of these home. There's enough for everybody if you want. And look at what God talks about the heart. What's He mean? I'm looking at the back side of the page. Like Psalm 101:2. I will be careful to lead a blameless life. When will you come to me? I will conduct the affairs of my house with a blameless heart. Psalm 119:58. I have sought your face with all my heart. Be gracious to me according to your promise. Psalm 139:23. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Over and over in the Old Testament, you see this parallel. When the Jews talked about the heart, they meant your mind, your will, your thoughts, your emotions, all of it jumbled together because how I think and how I act and what decisions I make are all based on all of that as one big combination. And over, the Bible speaks to the heart. When I started reading through passages of saying, well, how do we get this one? How do we learn this one then? How do I love God with all my heart? And, when I was in the Pentecostal circles, it was like, well, it's the worship frenzy. If you didn't feel all crazy in the worship frenzy, then you missed it. And I would look back later at this stage of life and say, oh, that was wrong. That was wrong teaching to me. In fact, the Bible pretty much explicitly tells us how we're going to love God and what it looks like. It's found in 1 John chapter 4. Not the only place. There's many places, but this is a good one for today. 1 John's at the very back of your Bibles. Just before Revelation, you'll see the book of 1 John. Very, very back. And it's page like 834 in the blue and white Bibles. In 1 John chapter 4, and by now, the Apostle John's writing this letter to all the churches that are undergoing persecution, having a hard time in the Roman Empire. All of the other apostles are dead. They're all gone. He's the last of the old remaining man. His friends have been killed. And he sends this letter out to the churches saying, you need to know. You need to know what to do, because he realizes he won't be around much longer either. He'll be the last of the 12 apostles. The leadership of the church is changing, and he wants the whole church to know what is right. When he's gone, this is what you need to do. And he says, dear friends, chapter 4, verse 7, dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. Now skip down to the bottom paragraph there. Last few sentences of that chapter. We love because he first loved us, verse 19. Whoever claims to love God and yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. Now, when I first read this, I disagreed with that, quite frankly. I'm like, God, you're wonderful. You're holy. You're righteous. You're perfect. You're blameless. You're all good. You're justice. You're all powerful. It's easy to love you. But now you're telling me the way I love you is how I love all these crazy people? I don't know if you know this, but people can be idiots. People can get on your nerves quite a bit. And now he's saying how you love the people is how you love me. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me, because people are messed up. People are greedy and selfish and spoiled and all these other crazy things about people. They are not you at all, God. You're easy to love. They're hard to love. And now you're telling me love the people, and that's a reflection of whether I love you? How can that be? How can that possibly be? So I sat and I reflected on this for a long time, and I thought, well, okay, if God is a God of compassion, and the Scriptures tells us he is, how do you know what compassion is? The only way for you to truly understand compassion is if you get engaged in the life of someone, you start interacting in the life of someone whose hurts and pains and woundedness is broken to the point where your heart goes out to them and you're like, I want to help alleviate that suffering. Now, some of us can say, well, I can hear about compassion and that's good enough, right? I don't actually have to do anything about the suffering. I just hear about it and I'm good to go. But the answer is, no, that's not really true. That's our Western civilization Greek way of thinking, right? We hear about it, we think we know it. No, you know it when you experience it. When your heart gets engaged and your emotions are tied in, it's both a logical, willful understanding and it's an emotional connection. Then you start to say, oh, I'd heard about compassion before, but I never experienced it until I reached out to help someone whose life was broken and wounded and hurt. And I felt what it felt like to give to someone desperately in need something that they needed to get them out of a terrible difficulty. What about justice? God is a God of justice. How do you understand justice if you don't know what oppression is? Until you've experienced oppression, until you've seen oppression, until you've got down in the trenches with someone who's been oppressed by some terrible system or some awful abusive situation that they've been in and controlled by, you cannot understand what justice really means. It's just a logic disconnect out there. Over and over, start looking at the attributes of God. And I will tell you that when you look at the attributes of God, you cannot learn them or know them until you've experienced them with other human beings, right? When you look at the gifts of the Spirit that's mentioned, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control is one. Self-control. How are you going to learn self-control? Well, as long as you're by yourself, you don't know. You don't learn self-control until you get around a bunch of knuckleheads who drive you crazy. And then you start learning, wow, I have to harness myself, my own ambitions, my own plans, my own rights, my own way of thinking how things have to be done. I need to control myself, and it's only these other people around me who teach me that. And now I understand God better because of what's happening. Mercy. God is a God of mercy. How are you ever going to know mercy? Mercy can't just be, well, God saved me from my sins and that's it. Because, oh no, the understanding of mercy has to be, there comes a point when you are wronged, when someone has wronged you, offended you, betrayed you, and you feel the pain and the angst and the hurt of all of that, and then one day they say, will you forgive me? Will you forgive me? And in that moment, you are wrestling with, oh, no, I want justice. No, I want revenge. No, I want all these other things, you see. And when you instead extend mercy, you say, oh, man, I understand God so different now. I appreciate now. I see what God did for me. He extended mercy when I asked for forgiveness. That was just a concept to me before. But now I feel it, and I experience it, and I know it. It's interesting because a lot of us are like, well, I love God. It's his kids I can't stand, right? Try saying that to a parent sometime. See how that builds your relationship with them, right? In the New Testament, I went through and I looked at one another's. Got your little blue sheet, 60 different one another's. By the way, I could have come up with more because I've used different translations. When I say one another's, it's all the times in the New Testament we're given a command of how we're supposed to treat one another. What are you supposed to do with one another? And I'm reading on the backside of it again. Ephesians 4:32. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you. Ephesians 5:18 and 19. Do not be drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit, speaking to one another with psalms and hymns and songs from the Spirit. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord. Ephesians 5:21. Submit to one another out of reverence of Christ. Philippians 2:3. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves, and on and on and on the one another's go. I think the measure of a church is how well are you doing the one another's. Loving one another, being kind to one another, being patient with one another, enduring one another, persevering one another, strengthening one another. On and on they go. I thought, that'd be a good one to put up on your bathroom mirror or something and just say, okay, every morning I'm going to pick one. There's 60 of them. So for the next 60 days, one of them is going to be my theme for the day. And see, I don't know what you're going to do. And it says greet one another with a holy kiss, though. Romans 16:16. You have to figure that one out yourself. I can't tell you everything. There has to be some room for God to explain stuff for you. I think when you look at a church, you start to measure it. You say, how are you doing on the one another's? Which is not how we measure church. In America, that's not what we do. In America, we measure church by how entertaining it is, right? We've all done it. We go to churches and you're checking out, well, how good's the music? How excellent's the sermon? Was it thought-provoking and witty? Was it easy to listen to? We judge and critique the show part of everything. We walk into the buildings and we're checking out the ambiance and the atmosphere. Was the coffee any good? Does the building look comfortable? We will probably look around the room and say, is there anybody here who I might be friends with? Once we start saying that, we're starting to get into the real area of church. Prior to that, it's all just the trappings of church. It's Americana church, right? It's all the stuff that we've gone to. Many times, you've either been this person or met this person who willfully chose a big church to go to for the single reason that they wouldn't have to know anyone. That they could go and sit in the back and be in the church and listen to the whole show. They come 5 minutes before and they leave as soon as it's done. In fact, sometimes they're already scooting out the door as the last song is still being sung, because the whole point is, I don't want any relationships in this church, but I can feel good about myself that I go to church and say I can go there. And the scriptures would say, you got it completely wrong. But we do that. We do that. We judge and critique the churches on stuff that the Bible says, that's the important stuff. How good the music is. Now, I like my music good. I like decent sermons. I like that. But scriptures would say, oh, you want to know what a church is? You want to know whether it's a good church or not? Keep this list of one another's. Start looking at that, saying, do they do this? Does church do that? Does the church do that? And then here's the other kicker. Here's what we do. We walk in and we say, I'm going to assess as I'm visiting this church how well it loves me. We do that, right? Was I greeted? Was I treated right? How do I feel? How do I feel in this place, right? That's what we do. And the scriptures would say, oh yeah, see, you already got church wrong. You're already on the wrong side. You walk in saying, who can I give to? Who can I love on? Who can I extend myself to? Who does God want me to meet today? See, that's real church. So let's be honest. We're Americans. We spend probably 90% of our time doing fake church. And then we say later, well, I want to build an authentic church. It's like, we got it wrong from the start. We enter into the room with the wrong mindset. We already walk in thinking about ourselves. And we walk in critiquing all the stuff that's the trappings. And then when Jesus says, okay, you want the real church, here it is. Be kind to one another. Regard one another as high as yourself. Have have a strength in one another. We say this, it's like, oh, well, I don't intend to be like that involved. I don't intend to do that. And that's where you start to see some of the big changes. We thought when we moved up here, one of the things we discussed at length as a group, a core group that was kind of remaining downtown, is we want church to feel different for us. We want it to be different. The only way church is going to work is if we can get to know each other. The only way church is going to work is if we can build friendships. And you cannot build friendships going to any church service in the United States of America because they're not designed for you to build a friend. They're designed for you to listen to a presentation and sit during the presentation and leave. That's how America church is built. You will not make a friend in church if all you do is go to church services. In any church in America, it's not built for you to do that. Now, if you are the kind of person who says to someone afterwards, hey, I've just met you, let's go to lunch after church. Now you can build a friendship. You cannot build friendships sitting here listening to someone talk. So if you're going to get engaged and involved in church, it needs to be a place where friendships can be built. And as we talked about, if we're going to love God with all our heart, it's how we connect with each other, how we get to know each other. We got to hear each other's stories. We got to hear the pains and the hurts. We got to hear the joys and the victories. We got to know what people's hobbies are. We got to know what makes them laugh. We got to get to know each other better. And the only way to get to know each other is if we would create a team, maybe, that we would call the Heart Team. And the Heart Team's responsibility in our church will be to throw parties. Because if we throw parties and have lunch together and hang out with each other offline and do things like that, we will get to know each other. The stories will get told. The friendships will be built. And we can start doing the one another's for real. So we're like, well, if we had a Heart Team, what would they do? Well, we'd do things like open mic nights, and we'd do stuff like when we had swing dance just Friday night in here, right? And there's like 100 Whitworth kids, jazz band from Whitworth, that was probably why. Colleen's teaching everybody to do Lindy Hop swing dance, 1940s era music. We would put on events like that. We would have stuff go down where we'd say, we would build, instead of an auditorium that sits empty 6 days a week waiting to fill it on Sunday morning, we would build an auditorium that could be used the other 6 days a week, where people could come and sit at tables on a Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon or a Thursday morning or any time during the week that the place is open, and they could make friends by having coffee in their church with their friends. Wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't that be a way to build community and relationships? And so when we left downtown, we said, no auditorium that sits empty. Coffee shop that gets occupied and is available. You could come to your church 7 days a week here and make friendships. You know, some of you don't even know. I'm building all kinds of friendships down here. There's a lot of people I'm meeting down here that are fascinating. All day long, meeting fascinating people. A lot of them don't even attend church here, but they're fascinating folks. And so we said, let's build a church where we could get real with each other, create relationships with each other, start investing in each other, and we have to be able to do it offline because a church service won't do it. It's not good enough. Church service isn't built for that. And so we began to look at, what if a Heart Team did stuff like, what if we did something like we had maybe once a month we had board game night. We did this in Whitestone, a church I planted. About once every 6 weeks we did board game night, where we would set up different short board games on 8 tables or whatever. And then you came and just sat at a table and you played Taboo, or you played, some short game that all lasts real quick. And then every 20 minutes we'd ring a bell and everybody'd have to get up and do shuffle and sit at a new table. And you know what? When you play board games, you get to know people. I don't know if you know this, but when you play board games, your stuff comes out. It comes out. So you suddenly realize who's funny, who's witty, who gets angry, who's competitive, you start to know each other. You play a few board games, it's like you're going to become an authentic church playing board games, right? You're going to start to become real with each other. And then in that realness, some of the stuff will be celebrated and some of the stuff could get challenged. But you start doing stuff like that, it's like you become a real church. You start making friends. We thought, wouldn't it be cool if that's part of our vision? When we're building heart, we're building community. And so when we do stuff like, hey, we're doing lunch today after church, it's for anybody who wants to stay. Stay if you didn't even know about it. Please stay and have lunch with us, because here's what it comes down to. God wants you to start learning how to do one another's, because you don't know how to love God until you know how to love the people around you. You don't. You start loving the people around you and getting deeper and deeper and carrying them through life, and they carry you through life. You start to say, wow, I really understand God now. I went through a season of my own life where I said no to all of that. I went through a season of my life where I left. I'd gone to a Christian Bible college, hated it. Came back, stayed in the Holy Roller Pentecostal Church, hated it. And I was probably about 19, I might have been 20, when one day I walked out of church and I said, I'm done. I'm sick of these Christians. I'm sick of church. It's over. It's done. I don't want anything to do with it. And for the next 5 years, I wouldn't have a Christian for a friend. I didn't want to hang out with a Christian on a Friday night. I didn't want to know Christians. I didn't want to spend time with Christians. And I sure as heck was never going to set foot in church. Somewhere in all of that thinking, the Word of God, the Spirit of God was still inside me. And I would have said it during no season, I believe the Bible is real. I believe Jesus is the Son of God. He died on the cross for the sins of the world, and He rose again from the dead. But whatever America has built as church is wrong. That the religion in America has so twisted and perverted what the New Testament teaches that the only way church could be salvaged is to put a match to it, burn it to the ground, and start all over. And for 5 years, that's the way I was. And one day, and I don't know why, to this day I don't know why, but God nudged me and pushed me to go back to a church. And it was in the mid-'80s, and I went back to this brand new church that was starting up in down on Nora by North Central High School called Calvary Chapel. And a guy named Jimmy Kempner was pastoring it. And I wandered into this church, and I had come out of this church where my good buddy Chuck, who runs sound for us a lot, he came his very first Sunday in this church. He had holes in his jeans, long hair, hippie type, right? And it was early 1980s. He had long hair and holes in his jeans. And when he went, there's Chuck right there. And when he walked in, and yeah, no long hair anymore for either of us, pal. Those were the days. Chuck walked into church his very first time in that church, and usher, as he entered the door, said, "Hey, we don't want your kind coming to our church." That was his opening greeting. He went, anyway, tougher than I am. I was done with it. So I go to this Calvary Chapel. I don't know why I'm there. They're doing a Thursday night service. I'd wander on a Thursday night. I sit near the back. I watch these guys. Jimmy Kempner says, we're going to bring the elders of the church down for an offering now. And these guys in flip-flops and cutoffs and bib overalls and tank top shirts come strutting down the aisle. I'm like, well, this is different, right? It's so different from what I was used to. And I sat there for a while, and I started going to that church because it just felt fresher to me. I don't know. It just felt fresher. And then Ken Ortiz came as the pastor, and the church started going. But see, here's the thing. I did not like Christians. So I'm like, I'm here to hear what God might say through His Word. I'm here to do that, and that's all. I'll learn some Bible, but I don't want to know these people. I don't want them as my friends. So I would sit alone somewhere in church. And then as church started to fill up, it's like, well, I'm moving up to the balcony where nobody sits because these folks are sitting near me now. So I moved up and I sat in the balcony where I could spread out and no one would sit by me. And then if someone actually would come and sit by a big open balcony, someone would come and sit near me. I'm like, what are you doing? I'd get up and I'd move. Sit over there far from someone, right? And then the balcony would fill up more and more and more. So one day you couldn't actually find a place to sit where no one was sitting by you. And it made me very uncomfortable. And one day, Ken Ortiz was just preaching away. And it was one of those days, and we've all had this. You've had it here, I'm sure, where the preacher's sermon, you're just not into it, and you're hearing wah, 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 wah. You're listening to Charlie Brown's mom all for 40 minutes, right? So he sounded like Charlie Brown's mom to me that day. And I'm like, I'm just going to read the Bible. I'm just going to sit here and read the Bible till he's quiet, and I can gracefully get up and leave. So I'm just sort of milling my time, and I'm going to do the thing you're not supposed to do. I'm going to flop the Bible open, and I'm going to read whatever it says. So I flop it open. It says, any man who says he loves God and hates his brother is a liar, and the truth is not in him. What do you do when that happens? You turn the page, folks. You turn the page. So, I turned the page, and dang it, if that verse wasn't repeated. So I sat there for a second, and I realized, okay, God, you're telling me that everything I'm saying about you're true, and your word is true. These people I can't stand. You're telling me that I'm a liar, and the truth is not in me. So I can either A, leave my Bible in that pew, or actually it was a little folding seat back, whatever. I can get up out of this chair, leave my Bible here, walk out the doors, and never come back again and just consider myself lost and cut off. Or I can say I will try to like these people. And you're not going to believe this, but it took me the entire 45, 50 minutes of Ken's sermon to make that decision because that's how resistant I was. Finally, near the very tail end, okay. And I think I probably still wrestled with it for the next several days. What do you do? How do you start? I've gone to this church now for a year, and if someone was sat near me, I'd move. How do you start loving people now? And I didn't know where to go. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know the only talent I had to offer was I could sing and play guitar, and the guy who was singing and playing guitar wasn't very good on their Thursday night service, but you don't start there. Hey, I hate you guys, but I'll lead you in worship. Nah, that's not going to fly. So I joined the church softball team. I don't know where to begin. They had a softball team, so I joined the softball team. Started playing softball, went to the practices, real edgy, real timid, guys with tattoos. One guy came, and for the first week, he had his tattoo all bandaged up in an ace bandage. And finally, one day, the pastor, same pastor who was singing, leading worship, I didn't think was good at that, but he was a great guy. He gathers the whole team around, makes the guy take the ace bandage off, and he's got some tattoo of some, I don't know, naked mermaid or something. And he goes, all right, I'm here. Has anybody got a problem with his tattoo? Because I'm going to tell you right now, if you got a problem with his tattoo and you're not going to let him be on the team, you can leave the team right now. I'm like, well, that's different, right? So everybody just sort of kind of started letting all the guards down, getting on the softball field, yucking it up, getting to know each other, and starting to make friends. And I started like, okay, I'm getting relaxed. Some of these guys are like me. They're jaded, burned out people, been ripped off by church, been, received the judgmental stuff, received a lot of criticism, been treated unfairly, just all that stuff. One day I'm sitting in the balcony, and about 3-4 weeks into it, this kid sits next to me. He's about my age. And he's all fidgety. He's kind of hyperactive guy. I'm like, oh, you new here? He's like, yeah, I've never been to church before. This is my first Sunday. Oh, so what brings you in? He goes, well, I'm the new youth pastor. They just hired me, and I came up from California. Oh, you know anybody? No, I don't know a soul. You should join the softball team. So he joins the softball team, and he and I start to become friends. About 2 weeks later, he sits by me in church again. And I say, hey, I noticed in your bulletin that you are wanting someone to lead worship for your youth ministry downstairs on Sunday morning. Is anyone helping you with that? He goes, no, I'm not getting anybody help. So I can play guitar and sing a little bit. I'll help you out for a few weeks till somebody steps up. He goes, oh, would you? That'd be great, man. So I would go down help him out, get the thing started till somebody stepped up, and I would lead worship in the youth group for about a year. And I was probably 4 months into leading worship in the youth group when the guy who was leading worship on the Thursday night thing wanted to step down. He didn't want that job anymore. He never felt it was him. He was doing it to fill a gap. And so they were in a church staff meeting and saying, well, we need someone who could lead worship on Thursday nights. Who do we get to lead worship? And Rick, the youth pastor, says, well, I got a guy leading down in the youth ministry. Is pretty good. We'll put him out. Let's ask him. Okay, we'll talk to him. Well, the guy who was leading went out and told everybody I was going to do it before they asked me. So by the time they asked me, I'd had 20 people come and say, hey, I hear you're leading worship on Thursday nights now. What? And so I met with the pastor, at that time Ken Ortiz, and I said, I'll do it for 4 weeks, Ken, and then I'm out. I'm not going to make a major commitment to this. And he and I were happy with that. And so I started, and I would lead worship on Thursday nights for over a year until they hired Bill and Lori Klein and brought them on as the kind of the permanent people. So I went from sitting in the balcony, if anyone sat near me, I'd move, to leading worship in that church in 6 months, in a 6-month time frame. Just breaking the walls down, letting my heart melt, changing my mind, letting God say, if you'll let me, I will transform you. And really, that's the whole kind of thing of where we're at as a church now. Some of you have been burned by church. Welcome to the club. The only people who have not been burned by church in the room are people who have not attended church very much. That's just the reality, right? Church people can hurt you. Guess what? Non-church people hurt you too. People hurt people. Everybody's doing it. And God keeps saying, get back in the game. If you've been knocked down, get back up. You've been falling on your face, get up and make it happen. Don't quit. Because in the end, God's saying, you don't even understand me until you can do this with other people. I need you to learn about mercy by experiencing it and giving it. I need you to learn about compassion by experiencing it and giving it. I need you to learn about justice and oppression. There's so many things you need to learn, and the only way you can learn them is when you're engaged with other people in a relationship. And the relationship's got to be real and genuine. And the deeper you go with a variety of people, the more you will learn about yourself and God. If you want to stay surface, your relationship with God will always be surface. If you want to go deep, it's going to require you to expose, get out there. It's going to require you to get back in the game. There's an old Sinatra song that has a lyric. It says, each time I find myself flat on my face, I pick myself up and I get back in the race. And I so love that line of the song that I asked my girls to sing that song for us as we close. So why don't you guys come up here? And as they sing this old Sinatra song, it's called That's Life. As they sing it, I want you to reflect on the whole imagery of the song. It's beautiful because it's like, hey, I've been up and I've been down, I've been in and out, I've had it all, highs and lows, and in the end, you just got to keep going. And that's your whole, that's the challenge I present to you, is that God's asking you to keep going in church, keep going with Christians, keep going with the people around you, because he says, I'm going to change you, and you're going to love me and learn to love me even deeper by the relationships you build in this place. If your church is a different church home, go build the relationships there, that's cool. But if you're starting to say, gathering house is where I go to church, if you're out and about in the public and someone ever asks you, where do you go to church, and you say, well, a gathering house, even if you haven't been here for 10 weeks, know that God's saying, build the relationships there then. That's where you need to be building friendships. Oh, Lord Jesus, that is life. It is high and it is low. We've been puppets, we've been poets, we've been pirates, we've been paupers, we've been pawns, we've been kings and queens. And Lord, today we stand saying, all right, Lord, I want to know you better. I want to love you better. I want to be obedient to you. And so I will try. I will try to build friendships in this community and take the ones I have even deeper. And I know as I say that, it's going to take investment on my time. It's going to take some risks. Some people will let me down, but that's life. And some, Lord, may become the best friends I ever had in the world. And that's life too. And so, Lord, I ask that your Spirit pour out on us so that we can become the children you want us to be, loving each other. And then, Lord, give us the open arms to love whoever you would bring to us. That you said, here's one of my children who needs that love. And you would send them to us because you know we are faithful and true to give the love that you want given to others. This we ask in your most holy name. Amen.